The lighting man, where's the lighting? Oh. The lighting man just came for dinner. Thank you for coming out, everybody. We're very happy to be playing here again so soon. It means you can't get enough of me. That's what that means, right? I'm guessing, I don't know. I'm very impressed. He doesn't play shit, except for basketball. And I talked to him behind my guitar already, which he loves it way more than basketball. What do you think of that? And he doesn't know this is a 1 hour speech. He's going to have to stand and No. I'm very happy to have with me a musician who had played in my very first band in 1978. And he's back playing with me again. He's played with everyone under the sun since that time. The great Philippe Sace on keyboard. Also joining me on drums, another former alumni from the 80s, played with me in several bands and a bunch of records in that time period. The great Tommy Brookline on drums. Joining me, I'm very happy to have with me and proud to have him, this wonderful bass player from Venezuela, Elias Tono. And that's it. So anyway, No. Okay. This goes back to 1981, and I was doing a solo acoustic guitar tour of the world. And I had asked promoters in each town that we went into who was the hottest player of percussion. And he recommended Doobie when they played the Tampa Bay area. And since then, we've been together. I think it's the longest relationship I've ever had in my entire life. Musically speaking, of course. Doobie Ortiz, great Doobie Ortiz. Okay, now the whole idea of this tour is to go back in time to those early records from the mid-70s, from the heyday of the recording industry. And this was a record that I have to say, Chick inspired me to write the music for this record. At a time when I hadn't even moved out of my parents' house yet. He said, man, the way you play, you have to write. So I just tried writing, and this is some of the music from the record. But we're going to start with a piece from the first track from Land of the Midnight Sun. It's called The Wizard. Here we go. Thank you so much. Thank you. Now we're going to do the title track of Land of Midnight Sun. It's something I haven't done in 50 years. And this was inspired totally by a chick who kind of pushed us to write music, all three of us, Stanley and myself. And it was a real gift being part of that band when I was 19 years old. And I was just right out of music school. I had seen Return to Forever. They were my favorite band back then. So I had gone to see them a number of times. Even while I was at school, the last time I saw the band while I was at school, I think it was in my second or third semester, and they had Earl Klug playing. And Earl Klug was playing a Les Paul through a Marshall. I said, wait a minute. He doesn't play electric guitar. He's a wonderful acoustic player. So I called a friend of mine back in New Jersey. This friend of mine was like my older brother. You know, he was right out of Woodstock, pothead to the max. But he was also an amateur recording engineer, and he just happened to have a tape of me. Because I said to him, man, I'd love to play with that band. I didn't tell him to go and deliver the tape to Chick. But he took it upon himself. He goes into the city, New York, and he finds the management. And he says, you gotta hear this tape. Well, this tape was made on a New Year's Eve when I was 17. And Michael always followed me around. He was like my sister's friend. I was 7 years older. But right out of Woodstock, I mean, just picture, you know, this hippie, always high, but the nicest guy on the planet. So it was on New Year's Eve. He slips with this little tab. I said, what is that? He goes, don't worry about it. Take it. So I took the tab, and I had the most beautiful trip you can ever imagine. And I'll never forget it since that night. So he takes this tape and he brings it in, and I get a call from Chick while I was at Berkeley that we wanted me to join the band. I said, well, what did you hear? He said, I heard a tape your friend Mike gave me of you playing on New Year's Eve. I said, oh, sheesh. So I go home to my parents' house, and my mother goes, what are you doing home from school? I said, Mom, I'm playing with Chick Corea. She goes, who's Chuck Corea? I said, wow, Chick Corea, my favorite band, Return to Forever. My father's going, Mike, what the hell are you doing home from school? I said, Dad, you're not going to believe this, but I'm playing Carnegie Hall on Wednesday night. He goes, get the hell out of here, you're not playing Carnegie Hall. We just went to music school. I said, Dad, I'm playing with my favorite band, and I'm playing Carnegie Hall. This went on for an hour, completed. Make a long story short, I go to 2-3 days rehearsal. It went very well. They liked what they heard. I was nervous beyond belief. And then they send a car out to pick me up for the sound check, and I take my parents. My father's going, this is a hoax. It's gonna be a hoax. This is long before Donald Trump used the word hoax. And he goes, this can't be for real. I said, Dad, no, this is really happening. He goes, oh, you know, to save face, he had to say this. He goes, well, you know, I always told you that you get the Carnegie Hall. You know, I always told you that. I said, yeah, I know that. Practice, practice, practice. But I'm thinking to myself, no, it was acid, acid, acid. That's how I got to Carnegie Hall. That's my story. I never did tell Chick that. And now that he's gone, I could say, you know, but I credit him with a lot of where I am today. You know, I must admit. Thank you. We're going to play now Land of the Midnight Sun. Hope you remember this one. Okay, this next one is from the new album. Everybody go to the bathroom at the same time? It happens. It happens. Prostate at that age, oh man. You know they said, I won't get into that. I want to say something there. Oh, what the hell? No. I mean, anyway, this one was, I have a daughter, a very young daughter, okay? Ava, yeah, she's really a big inspiration to me, you know, the joy is immense. I have 3 daughters, actually. But the littlest one is, she inspired this next piece. I have 3 daughters, they also inspired different music at different periods of my career, you know. 3 different moms, that's a whole other story. And 6 lawyers, that's a whole, you know, which is why I'm playing here tonight. Man, if you see musicians in their 80s and 90s on tour, it's because of, definitely, except for McCartney, maybe. Yeah, oh yeah, that's right. So she had just seen the Nutcracker Suite and was just captivated by the ballerinas and the music of this amazing Tchaikovsky piece. And I've taken her to see it a number of times. And she attempted her own little ballerina thing. And it inspired me. Right at the moment when she was doing it, I started playing this ostinato in 5/4. It just came to me. And I started to sing this little nursery rhyme on top of it. So when she left, she goes to bed. I said, man, that was it wasn't only like kind of cute, it was good enough to write out. So I wrote the thing out, and then I completed this whole giant kind of piece and added parts to it. It just kept evolving to the point of when my co-producer said, now what you gotta do is you gotta add a symphony orchestra. And I went, what? So he had the right idea. So I flew to Italy and I recorded this. I was actually a chamber orchestra in Milano, and we're gonna play along with the orchestra now as the actual orchestra, because we didn't fly them in. They weren't available, but they're in that box. And this is what you hear on the record, basically. We're going to play along with it. It's called Ava's Dance in the Moonlight. Let's hear it for the guys, Food Safe. Tony Ortiz. Lies Tona. Tommy Brookline. We're going to take a short break. Take a short intermission, come back with some acoustic music, and then back to electric. We're right back. Thank you.